Good morning. I would encourage you to open up in your Bibles to Revelation chapter 3. Revelation chapter 3 is where we'll be in just a quick, short minutes. I want to appreciate or show my appreciation not only for your presence, but also your interest in spiritual things, whether you're a member here, whether you're visiting with us. We're thankful that you've chosen to take time out of your week to be with us. It's an encouragement to me. I think it's an encouragement to Nathan that you're here. I would rest assured that it is. But I know it's an encouragement to everybody else that you've chosen to be with us today, to worship God, to sing praises to His name, to glorify His name with all the saints. I was too young, and probably still am not super interested, but I was probably too young in the late 90s to really care that much about the stock market. The stock market is never really something that to me has been at the top of my interest list. I don't follow stocks, I don't follow charts. I know that is literally Zach's life right now. It's not any part of my life at all. But even though I wasn't invested in stocks, no pun intended, even though I wasn't interested in stocks whatsoever, there was one company that at the late 90s, early 2000s was always at the top of all the newsreels. And I remember sitting with my parents and watching the news and hearing the name. And it's a company called Enron. Enron was this company that if you're around in the 90s and especially the 2000s and you were aware of what was happening in the stock market, Enron in the 90s was this kind of unicorn company. It was a company that was founded in the mid-80s and it was just on this super high trajectory. It was posting amazing profits. It was a very innovative type of company. And it was one of those businesses that just had this reputation of being almost bulletproof. Of course, we all know the story of what happened to Enron. By the time you get to late 90s, early 2000s, Enron that at one point had a market capitalization of about $60 billion, which placed it among one of the more valuable companies in the world at that point. At some point, Enron started to kind of go downhill. You had a series of very high-profile executives leaving the company. You had some documents that were uncovered. And what was found out about the company Enron was that not only were they not doing that well, but they were doing so poorly and they were going to such extreme lengths to hide just how bad they were doing. And it wasn't just, even though it was at that point one of, I think, the biggest corporate failure in U.S. history, that's bad enough. But then you also have people going to prison over the situation. Executives from Enron were accused of this blatant cover-ups, blatant deception, manipulation of the market. And so almost when you look at the company of Enron, when you look at it in the 90s, you have one perception of it being bulletproof, of being high profile, of being this amazing company. And then you transfer into 2000s, you have a completely different viewpoint of Enron. In today's world, Enron is almost synonymous with the idea of failure, with the idea of deception, with the idea of cover-up. It's kind of become a byword for basically corporate malfeasance. And what you learn from Enron as a whole, as you look throughout the history of it, is your reputation, although great at one point, is kind of hanging by a thread. And sometimes what we see on the outside, and Enron was able to post amazing numbers for so many years, but sometimes what you see on the outside isn't always what the truth is. And I think when you look at the church in Sardis in Revelation, the 3rd chapter and verse 1, you see a church that's kind of built that way. Jesus goes or pulls no punches and wastes no time in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 1 by saying, you have a name that you're alive, but you are dead. And I can't imagine a thing that's more hard to hear as a church than something like that. If Jesus had written a letter to Hillside and he said, look, you have all these different things, but then he began the letter by saying, Hillside, you have a name that you are alive, but trust me when I say that you are dead. I think our first instinct, our first response would be kind of shock and almost feel insulted a little bit, even though it's Jesus that's talking to us. And then I think our second reaction would be something along the lines of, well, I know that it looks like that, but look at what we're doing over here. So we kind of try to dance around and try to show off what we're doing in order to hide maybe where we're in error, maybe where we're gone wrong at some point. I think eventually every church, especially when it's literally Jesus writing a letter to you, I think every church would come around to the idea of, yeah, we have a name, they're alive, but we're really dead. If Jesus tells you you're a dead church, rest assured that you are a dead church. But when you look at Revelation chapter 3, it's not all terrible. Look at what he mentions here starting in verse 1. Revelation chapter 3 starting in verse 1, and you have the authority stamp there about who's writing this to you in verse 1. When he says, he who has the 7 spirits of God, the 7 stars, says this. That is a huge authority stamp. He says, I know your deeds, that you have a name, that you're alive, but you are dead. Wake up, verse 2. Strengthen the things that remain, which are about to die, for I have not found your deeds completed in the sight of my God. So remember that you have received, or what you have received and heard, and keep it and repent. Therefore, if you do not wake up, I will come like a thief. He says almost the exact same thing about the second coming, I think, in Revelation chapter 16, 17, where he says, I will come like a thief, and you will not know at what hour I will come to you. But you have a few people, verse 4, in Sardis who haven't soiled their garments. They'll walk with me in white, for they are worthy. He who overcomes, verse 5, will thus be clothed in white garments, and I will not erase his name from the book of life, and I will confess his name before my Father, before his angels. He who has an ear, verse 6, let him hear what the Spirit says to the churches. This forms in Revelation chapter 3 kind of the midpoint of all these different letters that Jesus would write to the various churches. And so he talks to the church at Ephesus, he talks to the church at Laodicea, but this one at Sardis to me is always kind of interesting. And primarily because of the way he opens up by very blatantly saying, you have a name that you are alive, but you are dead. And the next 5 verses, what Jesus goes through is a virtual reboot of this congregation. If you want to kick this church in high gear, if you want to start it over, what you need to do is this, and this. And I think the temptation whenever we look at these 7 churches of Asia is to look at it 1900, 2,000 years in the future and say, I cannot believe how they let it get that bad. We look at the church in Laodicea and we can't imagine how you can become a church that is lukewarm. We look at the church at Ephesus and we say, I can't believe that you would have left your first love. How do you do something like this? And you look at the church at Sardis and you say, how do you rely so blindly on your reputation? And 2,000 years in the future, we look at it and we say, I can't believe that they would do something like that. But there's one quote I've heard about all 7 churches of Asia that's true about every single one of them, is that we are closer to them sometimes than we care to admit. We tend to sometimes, and I'm talking about churches as a whole, not just Hillside, but churches as a whole sometimes tend to become more like Laodicea than we would care to admit. Churches sometimes become more like Ephesus than I think we would like to acknowledge. And in some cases, churches become like Sardis, more so than I think we're comfortable with. But it's easy for us to look at the church of Sardis in Revelation chapter 3 and say, I know that this church is terrible. They're building on the reputation, but it's kind of hanging by a thread because the inside of it, the guts, are just a mess. And it's easy to look at that and say, I can't believe the church is that bad. But have you ever stopped to ask yourself what the Christians that made up that church was like? When we look at a church, all it is essentially is a collection of individuals. Hillside is made up of 110 individuals, people that come together to gather together to worship God, to praise His name, to glorify His name. But all of us collectively make up the entity known as Hillside Church of Christ. And so if the Sardis church in Revelation chapter 3 was known for having a reputation, a name that you're alive, that they're dead, what were the individual members like? And that's what I want to talk about this morning. How does a church that has a reputation for being alive but is ultimately dead, how does the church, what are the individuals inside of that congregation like? Because I think once we understand what the individuals inside that congregation are like, I think we'll understand a little bit more about how a church can be called something like that. And first and foremost, ladies and gentlemen, I think a church that is built like Sardis has members that have a fantastic Sunday morning smile. And you know what I'm talking about when I say this. When I talk about a person who has a Sunday morning smile, what I'm not talking about is somebody like Joyce who is always happy to see you. And if you've ever met Joyce, you know that she is absolutely delighted to meet every single last one of most of you. I'm not talking about somebody who's genuinely happy to see you. What I'm talking about is somebody who shows up to worship services on Sunday and Wednesday. And maybe they're dealing with some deep, dark struggle on the inside. Maybe there's a sin in their life that they have been struggling with, they've been fighting with, they've been praying about, but they just can't seem to beat it. And that's not an excuse. I'm not saying that all of a sudden everything's okay. What I'm saying is that they're struggling on a very fundamental level, and maybe have been struggling for years. Or maybe it's a person who's going through a period of really dark grief. Maybe they've experienced some kind of loss in their life or something that they can't really, or they don't really feel comfortable communicating to each other. And so when they show up on Sunday morning or show up on Wednesday night, they pull into the parking lot, they turn around that corner, they get in their spot, and they maybe have been crying the whole way there, maybe they've been thinking about it all day, but all of a sudden when they get out of their car, they put on a smile, they open up the door, somebody asks how you doing, and they say, I'm fine. Well, What's the problem with that? The problem with that is that you're not really being vulnerable with somebody. The problem with that is that if at my core, if that's me that's put on a Sunday morning smile, what the problem with that is when I walk through the door, what I'm needing is not what I'm getting. If I cannot be vulnerable with the people that I go to church with, ladies and gentlemen, then who can I be vulnerable with? We have friends at work, we have friends at school, we have friends in the world around us, and all of us have varying degrees of relationships with these type of people, or maybe I'm close with this guy, maybe I'm close with this person, and so we have varying degrees of relationships, but I will tell you right now, there is nobody who knows what it's like to go through your life like a fellow Christian. And if we walk into services and we put on this smile and we say, I'm fine, everything's great, when on the inside we are really, really, really struggling, then we're denying ourselves of the help that we so desperately need. And I'll tell you what it ultimately symbolizes. When I walk in and I have that Sunday morning smile, and it may be that I just don't really feel comfortable going into all the ins and outs, and maybe we need to meet some other time to talk about that, that's totally fine. But what I'm really communicating when I have that Sunday morning smile, week after week, month after month, year after year, what I'm really communicating is, I don't believe that you as a Christian love me enough to help me through that struggle. I don't believe that you're willing to get in the weeds with me and help me through this time of my life, whatever the situation is. When you talk about a church that has a name that they're alive, but they're actually dead, what you essentially have at its core is a group of pretenders, people who put on a good show, who do big things, who say great things, who make a good representation of it, but are really spiritually hurting on the inside. We need to drop that Sunday morning smile. I'm convinced that one of the biggest things that Satan, or one of the most harmful things that Satan has done for us, or done against us, is to convince us that when we gather on Sundays and Wednesdays, the last thing we need to be is vulnerable. That our purpose for gathering is not so much to lean on each other, to support one another, as Hebrews chapter 10, 24 and 25 talk about, but our reason for gathering together is to show off our trophies. That is the last reason for us to be here. I want you to look at 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 14. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, Paul is writing a very, very sarcastic letter at various points in time to this church at Corinth. And he says some things that are very pointed and very sarcastic, and then he kind of pulls the veil back. And he starts talking on a very emotional, fundamental level. And I think what you see here in 2 Corinthians 12 is kind of a little bit of both. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, starting in verse 14. He says, "Here for this third time I am ready to come to you, and I will not be a burden to you. For I do not seek what is yours, but you. For children are not responsible to save up for their parents, but parents for their children." There's a whole lot of dialogue up to that point in 2 Corinthians that kind of lays the groundwork for those statements. Verse 15, he says, "I will most likely gladly be spend and be expended for your souls. If I love you more, am I then to be loved less? But be that as it may, I did not burden you myself. Nevertheless, crafty fellow that I am, I took you in by deceit." That's where that sarcasm kind of comes into play. I took you in by deceit. Certainly, verse 17, "I have not taken advantage of you through any of those whom I have sent to you, have I? I urged Titus to go to you, and I sent the brother with him. Titus didn't take any advantage of you, did he? Did we not conduct ourselves in the same spirit and walk in the same steps?" Verse 19, "All this time you've been thinking that we're defending ourselves to you. Actually, it is in the sight of God that we have been speaking in Christ, and all for your upbuilding, beloved. For I am afraid that perhaps when I come I may find you to not be as I wish, and may be found by you to not be what you wish. That perhaps when I come there will be strife, jealousy, anger, tempers, disputes, slanders, gossips, arrogance, disturbances. I am afraid that when I come again, my God may humiliate me before you. And I may mourn over many of those who have sinned in the past and have not repented of the impurity, immorality, sensuality, which they have practiced." What Paul goes in depth on in 2 Corinthians chapter 12 is the relationship that he's supposed to have with these people by saying, first and foremost, when I come to you, you need to have cleaned up your act. And I'm afraid that when I come to you, you may think of me something completely opposite than what I'm trying to do. And as he mentions in verses 14, 15, and 16, he says, "I will gladly spend and be expended for your souls. Whatever I can do," Paul says, "to help you in your walk with Christ, I want to do that." Now here's the million-dollar question, ladies and gentlemen. Do I feel that way about my fellow Christians? And maybe sometimes when somebody walks in and you can kind of tell that they're having a tough time, or maybe you know that they're going through a tough time, and they walk up to you and you say, "How you doing?" They say, "I'm fine." You part your separate ways. You go, "Man, I'm glad that went by, so I have to deal with that right now." And nobody would ever say that. But we have lives to live. We have things to do. We have people to go see. We have lives to build. Why can I spend time, or why should I spend time with somebody else when after all I'm struggling with my own stuff? Do I have the ability, or do I have the willingness, rather, to spend and be expended for other people's souls? Am I conveying an attitude where you can drop that Sunday morning smile, or I'm willing to get into the weeds with you to help you, to encourage you? And do you have that attitude with me? I think this church at Sardis is also a church that is on complete spiritual autopilot. When you make the statement in Revelation chapter 3 and verse 1 that you have a name, that you're alive, but you're dead, essentially what you're saying to this congregation is you're just kind of spending every single day like it was the last one. That as long as we can keep up this facade, as long as we can keep up this big persona of who we are, then everything's fine. And ladies and gentlemen, we live our lives, and maybe it's just me, but I am very routine-oriented. We live our lives in much the same way every single day. We get up, we drink our 9 cups of coffee. Maybe that's just me. We drink our 9 cups of coffee, we go to work, we come home, we watch America's Got Talent, The Biggest Loser, we go to bed. We wake up the next morning and do it all over again. And unfortunately, sometimes what that does is it carries over into our spiritual lives. We show up here at worship service and we sing the same 5 songs. We sing the same order. We have our prayer. We have our Lord's Supper. We have the Bible class. We know Brady's going to make fun of Joe. And then we go on with our life. And every service, ladies and gentlemen, is exactly the same as it was the week before. And I can't remember a month ago if I was edified. I can't remember 6 months ago if I edified anybody else. But I'm just kind of on a situation of spiritual autopilot. And that's why I think it's interesting when you look at Revelation chapter 3, Jesus doesn't just say once, he says twice, wake up. Christianity is not a religion to be done on autopilot. Christianity is not something that we just kind of skim through in our life and say, well, dotted this T, dotted this I. You don't dot a T. I crossed this T, I dot this I. I did all these things, and now I go on about my life. It is something that is a constant pursuit for all of us. And if anybody knows anything about that constant pursuit, I would argue it's Peter. 1 Peter chapter 1, one of the first things he says in this letter. 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 13, he talks about this idea of being diligent, of striving, of pushing. Satan's done a fantastic job of convincing us that we can just kind of be lazy in regards to our religion. 1 Peter chapter 1, starting in verse 13. He says, therefore, prepare your minds for action. Keep sober in spirit. Fix your hope completely on the grace we brought to you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. As obedient children, don't be conformed to the former lusts which were yours in ignorance, but like the Holy One who called you, be holy yourselves also in all your behavior, because as is written, verse 6, you shall be holy, for I am holy. Of all the statements that Peter makes in that section, one of the things that jumps out the most to me is when he says there in verse 15, or verse 14, when he says, don't be conformed to the former lusts that were yours, but be transformed, be renewed, be holy, be pushing towards that. It's easy for us, especially if we're new Christians, or sometimes if we've been Christians for years. It's very easy for us sometimes to settle into a pattern of behavior that we had before we were Christians. Now, if 9 cups of coffee was your pattern of behavior, nothing wrong with that. Nothing sinful about that. And if anyone tells me any differently, I'm going to have words with them. That pattern of behavior isn't wrong. But what sometimes happens when we go on about our life is we settle back into the habits that we had. We say the same things. We're around the same people. We go to the same places. After a period of time, we kind of become reconformed to the life that we had just left. And what Peter says there in 1 Peter chapter 1 is, don't be conformed to that old life, but push towards holiness. Here's the secret, ladies and gentlemen. You will never, in verse 16, be holy as he is holy. None of us will ever achieve that spirit of holiness. We were as holy as God was. It's impossible. But that doesn't mean that we should stop trying. When he says, be ye holy as I am holy, that should represent every facet, every aspect, every turn of the dial, every second of our life. And it takes a long time for us to even get moving in that direction, much less approach even 0.1% of that. Look in Ephesians, the 5th chapter. I love what Paul says here in this passage. And I think it's fitting that in Ephesians chapter 5, this is right before that big armor of God where he says, stand firm therefore. And I tell you, stand firm. Ephesians chapter 5, starting in verse 6. What Paul says here in verse 6. As he says, let no one deceive you with empty words, for because of these things the wrath of God comes upon the sons of disobedience. Therefore, don't be partakers with them, for you were formerly darkness, now you're light in the world. Walk as children of light. For the fruit of the light consists in all goodness and righteousness and truth, trying to learn, verse 10, what is pleasing to the Lord. Don't participate in the unfruitful deeds of darkness, even expose them. For it is disgraceful even to speak of the things which were done by them in secret. But all things become visible when they're exposed by light, for everyone that becomes visible is light. Verse 14, for this reason it says, awake, sleeper, arise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you. One of the most poetically beautiful sections in the book of Ephesians. Verse 15, therefore be careful how you walk. Don't walk as unwise men, but as wise, making the most of your time, because the days are evil. Verse 17, don't be foolish, but understand what the will of the Lord is. Well, Paul understands in Ephesians, the 5th chapter, that it's very easy for us to fall into a form of spiritual stupor. And somebody walks up to you and tells you they're fine enough times, eventually we're going to believe it. You convince yourself enough times that I'll read my Bible tomorrow, that I'll tackle this sin tomorrow. Eventually, over time, our bodies will believe it, and we kind of fall into this spiritual autopilot where every week is the same as the last one. And that's why Jesus says in Revelation chapter 3, not once, but twice, that we need to wake up. I would encourage all of us to take an honest stock of our Christianity. And I don't mean our Christianity as it compares to Joe Kern. That's not what I'm talking about, which is great, by the way. I don't even think I could compare. Not our Christianity as it compares to other people. Not our Christianity even as it was 10 years ago. But take stock of our Christianity, our faith, our relationship with God now, and ask ourselves, where can I improve? What can I do better? Not just what have I defeated, but how can I move forward? That's how we break the spiritual autopilot curse. And we start to think about ourselves not in terms of look at what I've accomplished, but in terms of look at what I still have left to do. Because I guarantee you when we start thinking about what we have left to do in this life in terms of God, we'll realize that that list is about 10 miles long. And we need every second of every day to get started on that. The church at Sardis also, I would argue, was blessed with untouched resources. There's a couple of statements that Jesus makes to this church in Revelation chapter 3, where he says to them, quite frankly, he says, there are things that are there. Strengthen those things that remain. And then he also says, the next verse, he says, there are still some people who haven't soiled their garments. There's a lot of sin in that church, but there's some people who haven't soiled their garments. You have some things that remain, strengthen those. There are some people that haven't sold their garments, focus on those. There are assets in this church that need to be utilized. Ladies and gentlemen, there are assets in this church that need to be utilized. And it's very easy for us to look at this congregation and say, well, our attendance is growing week after week. We had 20 more people here this year than we had last year. And we had 20 more people last year than the year before that. Look at all the great things we're doing. And sometimes it masks the things that we could still be doing. I love the story, the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. To me, it just has so many themes. It has so many lessons and so many stories. Matthew chapter 25, look in verse 14. Matthew chapter 25, starting in verse 14. Keep in mind that this whole section here, Matthew 25, has an eye towards the final judgment. And that's the way I think we should be thinking about it as well. Matthew chapter 25 and verse 14. He says, for it is just like a man about to go on a journey who called his own slaves and entrusted his possessions to them. We have nothing to believe at this point that these are not untrustworthy slaves, considering he gives his possessions to these three. To the one, he gave 5 talents. To another 2, to another 1. Each according to his own ability, he went on his journey. And immediately the one who had received the 5 talents went and traded with them and gained 5 more talents. In the same manner, the one who had received the 2 talents gained 2 more. But he who had received the 1 talent went away, dug a hole in the ground, and hid his master's money. I cannot believe that third person did that. And as you look in verses 19 down through verse 22, 23, the other 2 people, the 5 talent, the 3 talent man, very similar stories. Show back up to their master. They say, look, I've got 5. I gained 5 more. The 3 talent man says, look, I had 3. I got 3 more. And in both situations, the response to each one one of those servants is exactly the same. Well done, thy good and faithful servant. But listen to the rationale. Because to me, it's always been interesting about how this one talent man, or rather why this one talent man, was the one that went and dug his talent in the ground. Verse 24, the one also who had received the one talent came up and said, Master, I knew you to be a hard man. I knew you were reaping where you did not sow, and gathering where you scattered no seed, and I was afraid. I went away and hid your talent in the ground. See, what you have is yours. Notice, he didn't lose it, which is essentially what this guy was worried about. What this guy was worried about was not fear of success. He was worried that either what he had done would not be good enough, or he was maybe worried that he would lose that one talent. Verse 26, his master answered and said to him, You wicked and you lazy slave, you knew that I reaped where I didn't sow, and I gather where I scatter no seed. What you ought to have done, verse 27, is put my money in the bank, and on my arrival I would have received my money back with interest. Therefore, verse 28, take away the talent from him, give it to the one who has the 10 talents, for to everyone who has more shall be given, and he will then have an abundance. But from the one who does not have, even what he does have shall be taken away. Throw out the worthless slave, verse 30, into the outer darkness. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. The question always is, when you read this parable, at least it is for me, when you read this parable, why is it that the one talent man didn't do anything with it? It's clearly not for lack of ability. The fact that he's entrusted with a talent means that he has at least shown some semblance of profitability in the past. It's certainly not as a result of opportunity, because both the 5-talent man and the 3-talent man were able to double their money. At the very least, what this 1-talent man could have done is the exact same thing those two guys did, and brought back one more talent. But he didn't. Instead, based on his fear, as he mentions in verses 24 through 30, because he knew the character of his master, what he did was he dug his talent in the ground so that then later he could present that talent. As we just said, at least he didn't lose it. And I think there are a lot of us, I think there are a lot of Christians in the world that will show up on Judgment Day, that will show up themselves, and they'll say, yeah, I didn't do anything with your talent, but I also didn't lose it. The reason that he dug it in the ground, because he didn't think it was that much. Maybe he didn't think he could turn that 1 talent into 5 talents, because the 5-talent man, after all, brought back 5 more talents. I just have 1 talent. If I get 1 more, that's insignificant. And we think sometimes that way in regards to our own salvation. I can't do this, I can't do this, I can't do that, I can't do these things, I can't do that. All I can do is this. And that doesn't really seem that important. So I'm going to sit in front of my TV. I'm going to watch Biggest Loser, which is a great show, by the way. I'm going to watch Biggest Loser, and I'm also going to snack the whole time while I'm watching it, preferably on M&Ms, peanut M&Ms. I'm just going to sit there. And when services roll around on Sunday and Wednesday, I could do something. I could at least maybe lead a prayer, because I've never led a prayer before. I could do that. Or I could at least mention or read my Bible in public with somebody. But that doesn't really seem that big. After all, Peter converted 3,000 people on Pentecost. That doesn't seem like that much. So instead of embarrassing myself and failing miserably and God looking at me and saying, how come you failed? What I'm going to do is I'm just going to sit back. I'm going to bury my talent in the ground, and then when God shows up on Judgment Day, I'm going to say, look, at least I didn't lose it. There's no growth there. The most important thing, though, is there's no effort. What we need to realize about our church, and especially about our own life, is we are blessed with so many untapped resources in this church and in our own spiritual life. Somebody says, well, I can't evangelize to people. I can't talk to them about the gospel because I don't know everything. I don't either. I know that comes as a huge shock to you. Paul and Shell and Cody don't know everything either. Peter didn't know everything either. He's 50 days removed from denying Jesus at the crucifixion. And yet he tried. I guarantee you that your presence here this morning, the little bit that we've at least read in the Bible so far this morning, equips you to teach anybody on earth. And so before you take stock of your life and you say, well, I can't do these things, think about what you can do in relationship to other people. And that's why Jesus looks at the church of Sardis and says, you need to wake up. You need to see those things that remain. You need to strengthen them, and you need to put them into action. Look at the people who haven't soiled their garments. Lean on them. Rely on them. Trust them. and use them to help you build. And finally, fortunately for this church, this was a church that was dead and had no idea. One of the saddest things in what we just read in Matthew 25, one of the saddest things as you look forward, at the end of that chapter is you have two groups of people, some on the left, some on the right. And as Jesus separates the ones on the left from the ones on the right, which is your right, the ones on the right, he says, enter into an eternal home. And they're surprised. We didn't see you sick. We never saw Jesus lame. We never saw him poor. We didn't help you. So it's a sense of surprise. And then when you look at the ones on the left, the ones who are going into eternal punishment, it's surprise, but it's also this kind of rationalizing. And what they say back to Jesus there at the end of Matthew chapter 25 is, look, we've done all these things. We did this, we did this, we did this. And Luke chapter 8, have we not prophesied in your name? Have we not in your name cast out many demons? Have we not done so many amazing things? And then Jesus says, to the shock of them, depart from me, you who practice lawlessness. I can think of all the emotions that we would feel on Judgment Day. The sudden surprise that maybe our soul isn't as secure as we thought it was is probably the worst. Because when you show up on Judgment Day, and we're as confident as we humbly can, but as we're confident that we have done everything that we can be, but then we also know that we've willfully forgotten all sorts of areas that we could have improved on, all sorts of sins that we could have repented from, all sorts of things that we could have helped and didn't. All the people that we knew had those Sunday morning smiles and yet took I'm fine as gospel and went on about our lives and didn't help them. We know that those are creeping in the rearview mirror. The church at Sardis fully believed that on Judgment Day, and that certainly if God was able to examine them, which God did examine them, but if God examined them, they would pass with flying colors. And I think that's the danger for any church. Size helps a lot with masking our insecurities. Size and great worship masks sometimes our failings as a congregation. Things that we can do better, people we can help, people we can talk to, systems that can be improved. We allow sometimes the very physical and the very carnal types of things to mask what we know that we need to do better on. The church at Sardis was full of people who were utterly confident in their salvation and yet had also willfully ignored all the areas that they could have improved on. And Luke, the 12th chapter. Luke chapter 12. Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 16. It says he told them a parable saying the land of a rich man was very productive. And he began reasoning to himself. I love that. All of us do that probably every day. He began reasoning to himself saying, what shall I do since I have no place to store my crops? Which, by the way, is subtly the most important sentence in this entire section. We'll come back to that in a second. Then he said, verse 18, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I will store all my grain and all my goods. Note real quick in verse 18, this guy's already loaded. It's not as if he needs a house. It's not as if he needs a barn. He's already got those. Verse 19, I will say to my soul, soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, be merry. But God said to him, you fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you have prepared? So is the man, verse 21, who stores up treasure for himself and is not rich towards God. Verse 21, that statement where he says the person who is not rich towards God tells you the things that this person could have done. And so in verse 16 and 17, when he says, what am I going to do with my time? Which that's the question that he asks. And that's why I mentioned a second ago, that's subtly one of the most important sentences in this parable. What am I going to do with my time? The answer should have been, get my soul right with God. But instead, what he does instead is he doubles down on the things he already has. He says, well, I'm so bored with my life, I'm just going to kind of kill time. What I'm going to do is I'm going to tear down my barns, I'll build bigger ones so I can increase my net worth, increase my wealth. I have a summer home, I need a winter home. I'm going to do that with my time. What Jesus says there, what God says there at the end of Luke chapter 16 in that section, as he says, or Luke chapter 12, it says, you fool, this night your soul is required of you. What you should have been spending your life doing is getting your soul right with God. I would wager that this person is somebody who probably thought, as so many of us oftentimes do, that we have time. That if I don't get this taken care of tomorrow, I can get it taken care of 20 years from now. Because after all, we all think that we're going to live to be 90, 95 years old plus. And so if I don't take care of my soul at 50, I can take care of it at 70. As we mentioned on Wednesday night, if Kobe Bryant has taught us anything, it's that nobody is immortal. But we don't know, ladies and gentlemen, what's going to happen the next day. And this church at Sardis had the reputation hanging by a thread and was allowing that reputation to sail them through all the different scruples of the rest of the world. They all looked at that and said, this is a church that stands for something. This is a church that's doing great works, when the reality was quite different. And as a Christian, far be it from me to put up a facade and say, look at all the things that I'm doing, and mask all the things that need to be done. If that's my relationship with the Bible, ladies and gentlemen, I'm dead and I don't even know it. And I will stand before God in complete confidence, saying, look at all the things that I've taken care of, when God says, look at all the things that you haven't. The church at Sardis wasn't made up of just one homogeneous group of people that were all the same. It was a very heterogeneous mixture of individuals, all of which relied on the reputation of that church to carry them into eternity. We have a fantastic congregation here, and I've been thankful to be a part of this congregation for the last 10 plus years. I loved every Sunday. I've loved every Wednesday. I love each and every most of you. Just kidding about that. I love each and every one of you. But when I stand before God on Judgment Day, it's not going to be, how did Hillside do? It's not going to be, how well did the church do? Did it grow? Did I get 5% year-over-year growth? Did I get that? The question is going to be, what did I do? Am I going to stand before God and give an account for my sins and for my triumphs and what I've done? I'm going to stand before God by myself and give an account for everything that I did in my life. And as much as I would love to stand next to each and every one of you and say, look at what the things that we've accomplished, I know that that's not the case. Don't allow a congregation that has experienced any type of prosperity or growth to mask you from your own individual situation. Christians at Sardis did. And because of that, God said there in verse 6, that I'm going to remove your lampstand from you unless you overcome. What is your soul like this morning? Is your soul apart from God? Are you somebody who's been living on spiritual autopilot, that has been putting on a Sunday morning smile? I would encourage you, whatever you need, whether it's to be vulnerable, whether it's to put on Christ through the waters of baptism, or whether it's to ask for the prayers of this congregation, humble yourselves and Christ will shine on you. And do it now as we stand and as we sing.